boundaries are what define every relationship. Every relationship, even marriage, is defined by certain boundaries, what things are permissible and what things are not, as agreed upon by the terms of the relationship and by the individuals in the relationship. And so it isn't to say that we're saying that boundaries mean cutting someone off and saying, I'm not trying anymore. I'm saying that boundaries are an integral part of every relationship.
Hey, welcome to Whitefields Community Church Sermon Extra. Great to have you with us once again this week. I'm here with Pastor Cady. He is the pastor of Whitefields Community Church here in Longmont, Colorado, and we are in our series, drawing to the end of our series called Strength and Weakness, and Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. And this week we were in chapter 12, the last section of chapter 12, and the message was called Spent for the Sake of Others. And if you missed any of that sermon, please head over to whitefieldschurch.com and you can download it there. Feel free to share if some of this a message that somebody that you know needs to hear. Maybe you need to hear it again. And of course, any of our streaming services, podcast or whatever those kind of things are, YouTube, Facebook, the whole shebang, just we're available everywhere. And if you would just, like, subscribe, smash that like button, as I'd like to say, and, just get involved. Any kind of interaction with this content certainly helps boost us in the ratings. And so when people Googling things about 2 Corinthians, about Paul's ministry, about being spent for others, that, we show up in that search and we can provide Christ-centered, gospel-centered answers to their questions. And so this week, we find ourselves in an interesting passage. Paul's kind of, this letter's been pretty rough, actually. I'd hate to have seen what the what was it called? The Stern letter? The
Stern letter. Yeah.
If this seems pretty stern, I'd hate to see what, Paul's definition of the Stern letter is, because he's been, he kind of uncorks it a little bit here. It's like he's been ramping up, like he's writing and just it's starting to flow, So as he's thinking about the things that the Corinthian church has been going through. And, 1 Corinthians had, his letter to them, and 1 Corinthians, that one was also pretty rough, and this one's also. And so the question comes up, with somebody like Paul, he's poured his life, as we saw when he goes through that list of all the things that he's gone through, and he's really poured his life into this church to the point where he's like, I'm not taking money from you guys. I am not, in any way, I'm not profiting whatsoever. And, you've accused me of this, you've accused me of that, and I'm the one who started this church. I poured my life into this church. And so the question kind of arises, at what point, do you just kind of say, okay, that's it. You guys are on your own. See you later. And as you said in your sermon, see you in heaven. Maybe. And you just kind of jettison, and next in your next missionary journey, you're like, I'm not going to Corinth. We're going to go left instead of right. So what talk about some of the boundaries, which, we could, of course, this could have application just in our own lives and from a pastoral leadership place, or just within, our own sphere of influence that we might have.
Yeah, I think there were times in Paul's life where he did draw boundaries, and there's a question over whether or not it was the right thing to do. So, for example, you remember after his first missionary journey, which he went on with Barnabas, then when they got ready to take their second missionary journey, Barnabas wanted to bring John Mark, his nephew, and Paul was like, if John Mark's coming, then you're not coming with me. We're going separate ways. And that seems like a difference in approach to what he's doing with the Corinthians here. So some people debate that, whether that was wrong of Paul to do that. Some people say, hey, it's normal and good to have boundaries, and say, hey, I'm not willing to go there and partner in that way. Other people point out the fact that later in Paul's life, like in 2 Timothy, he mentions John Mark being a comfort to him. In other words, apparently at some point they had reconciled their differences and now they're getting along and things like that. I think that's a really good question, though, because Jesus talks about things like this, right? Like if somebody demands that you go a mile with them, he says, then go 2. If somebody asks for your outer cloak, then give them your other cloak too, right? Just if somebody slaps you in the face, then don't slap them back, but turn your other cheek as well. And a lot of people ask the question, like, okay, at what point though do boundaries come into play here? And you say, okay, enough's enough, right? Like, at what point do the Corinthians treat Paul so badly that he just says, you know what, I'm actually done trying. And I think that's a really tough question to answer. But I think that the guideline that has to determine that needs to be love for the other person. So there are times, for example, when Paul talks about church discipline in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, for example, the goal of church discipline is not to punish someone for doing something bad. The goal of church discipline is to give that person a wake-up call so that they'll repent and be restored to the community of believers and restored in their relationship with God. And so I think that needs to be the driving thing. Like, okay, at some point, there certainly is a thing where you're enabling people to continue in unhealthy patterns by just kind of propping them up or keeping them on life support, if you will. And I think that Paul would not be in favor of that, right? That's not what we're talking about. And so it really does take some discernment and knowledge of the uniqueness of the situation to be able to say, okay, this is a situation in which, it's needed to keep pursuing, not give up on these people. And then there are other times where it's like, okay, maybe I need to just take a step back because this isn't healthy for that person or for me. That takes a lot of wisdom, and I don't think there's an easy answer to it. But I think that has to be our guideline. It has to be driven by love. And I think that's kind of the big issue.
And what do you think, when you think about the Corinthians, what was the issue that really was what Paul was actually fighting with them over? He talks to the super apostles, and what was the actual, it wasn't necessarily that Paul was offended that they had somehow offended him personally in some way. What was the kind of the greater issue that we're dealing with here?
Yeah, I think the bigger issue is that these would-be leaders in Corinth were preaching a different gospel, and they were leading people astray. They're majoring on their own pride, kind of like it was a very prideful thing they were doing. And it was kind of like based on like being more spiritual than other people, looking down on other people. It was just an ungodly, fleshly, prideful thing that they were doing. And they're preaching a different gospel, one that Paul says isn't even a real gospel, And I think that is why Paul got so involved and refused to give up, because it seems that the Corinthians were just easily led astray by whoever was talking in their ear at the moment. And I think that's what Paul, in a way, he sees these guys as kind of like hapless a little bit, and they're kind of like victims of their own gullibility and things like that. And so I think that Paul has like a lot of compassion for them, and so he's willing to overlook the fact that they've hurt and offended him, because I think it's not so much malice on their part as it is just immaturity and gullibility.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that, Paul is, what was the thought had was that Paul is, as a father, and I think that for me, that's a large aspect of this. And I think you brought it up as in the sermon as well, just as these are your kids. Mm-hmm. And Paul really looked at that way. And so, the question is like, well, when do I get rid of my kids? Well, do you ever get rid of your kids? And what is that turning point, And I think, that's I kind of like a lens through which Paul really has, like, this is his church, the people he's poured his life. These are his spiritual children, and he doesn't want to just, as you said, he's fighting tooth and nail, because these other imposters who are not necessarily part of the family are trying to wreck the family. Mm-hmm. And how many times have we seen that just happen in real life? And as parents, what do we get territorial,
Mm-hmm.
and is there anything wrong with that? No, those are our kids, those we're fighting for there, and I think it's just one of the lessons, just kind of as we've gone through this letter, seeing how deeply Paul really felt for his church.
And I think that gets back to love, right? Like, mm-hmm. That's what causes you to not give up on your kids and to fight for them and things like that. It gets back to genuine love for them, not just like Paul says, I'm not trying to get anything from you. I just care about you. And I think that's really important. But that idea of like caring for his kids, and yet, right? With kids and with anybody. Boundaries are what define every relationship. Every relationship, even marriage, is defined by certain boundaries, what things are permissible and what things are not, as agreed upon by the terms of the relationship and by the individuals in the relationship. And so it isn't to say that we're saying that boundaries mean cutting someone off and saying, I'm not trying anymore. I'm saying that boundaries are an integral part of every relationship. But what those boundaries are changes based on the nature of the relationship and where the stage of the relationship. So like if you think about kids, right? When kids start going off in certain areas that maybe you don't like, you still have boundaries, but it doesn't mean that you cut them off, right? So that's the issue there.
Yeah, I just thought of this story. I heard of a pastor telling how he had to decide whether to leave his kid in jail or not. He could have bailed him out. And he just decided, no, son, I think the best thing for you right now is to stay in jail. As much as it really hurt him, it just like, no, you need to go through this process, and you need to, and as you said, the important part is for the church. I think what Paul comes across in his letter is that whatever the church does, Paul is there for them.
Mm-hmm.
Even if he does choose at some point to cut them off, or if we always want to make sure that there is some kind of relationship that stays intact, that, when you're done dealing with your stuff, maybe you do need to go out, we're here. And as we looked at 1 Corinthians, with the restoration of that guy, they need to kick him out of the church. He's got to, deal with that sin in his life. But, we still want to be there. The goal is restoration,
Pick him up when he falls,
Yeah. And so I think that's an important part of what we've been studying at. So it's very, very interesting as we deal, as I was reading these words, and Paul's like, when I get there, there's sparks are going to fly, maybe, maybe they're not, it's like, depends on how you guys react. And so, as we're drawing close at the end of this letter, it's becoming very, very interesting. And so, as I said, we are coming kind of to the end of this letter, and so I hope you've been on this journey with us through 2 Corinthians. It's been a fascinating journey as we just kind of looked at that idea of strength and weakness, and coming up on the Advent season right now, and we just see that. I mean, strength and weakness, it's just exemplified in our Savior Jesus as he became a baby, became one of us, and that's going to be the title of our series, One of Us. In weakness, he was crucified for us, and it's just something we can take, so many lessons from, and Paul just kind of exemplified that for us in this letter. And so one more chapter to go, and our Advent series will be coming up quickly. And so if you're living in the area and you want to come and join us, we're going to have our Christmas Eve services at 4 and 5:30 on the 24th, and we just love to see you if you are in the area. And so whitefieldschurch.com if you missed the sermon, and we'll see you again next week. God bless.